Hi everyone, my name is Cody Rue, and this is the Church of Logic. I'm going to talk about computability again, and I have to admit I haven't prepared this podcast as well as the last one, so I might be a little bit more hesitant, and things are going to be a little bit more open-ended, but hopefully you'll get something out of this. So, last time we talked about the history of computation. I explained that a bunch of people came up with notions of computation that all turned out to be equivalent in some way. I didn't explain the equivalence in detail, but I sort of gave the intuition. You can translate, the input to one mode of computation into the input for another one. And, turns out that with respect to this translation, all these different modes of computation only allow you to do the same things, right? If you can compute a certain operation in one setting, then by translating the simple translation, you can compute these operations in the other setting. Now, okay, it's worth at this point to remind that something's happening when you're translating, but that something, it seems so straightforward that it's not worth worrying about it. It's a reasonable thing to suppose that kind of these translations are irrelevant and that all these computation modes are equivalent. So you have all these equivalent modes of computation, and your theory is that this really captures everything you can do when you're actually trying to solve a mathematical problem, or when you're actually trying to just compute something, right? If you have a set of rules and operations that consistently allow you to do something, say win at chess, then those rules can necessarily be written down in one of these settings, say, the formalism that Turing defined, Turing machines. So it's not clear why one would actually believe this. You wrote down a bunch of, mathematical definitions. You proved that they were all equivalent in some sense, but why should that be everything that you can possibly do, right? Maybe it just betrays a lack of imagination. And this is certainly possible. This is a philosophical question, so there's no real mathematical consensus. But people have come to sort of agree that this is the correct definition of computation. And it's worth noting that this is a very rare phenomenon in philosophy, right? It's very, very rare that people agree that a philosophical concept, in this case, the definition of computation, is the correct one, right? So it's worth trying to take a beat and understanding why this notion of computation is sort of so respected, so believed to be the correct one. And one of the reasons for that, and it's also something I'm going to need when I talk about incompleteness, is the ability for all these systems to essentially simulate another machine, right? This ability to say, hey, I have a bunch of computation rules. I'm going to set down one single set of rules that allows you to take as input another machine and run it. That is a fundamental insight that I'm going to need later. And it's also kind of a compelling thing, a compelling argument, because this ability to take as input another machine and run it, and perhaps even then that other machine that produces a third machine that runs as well, that is really something that gives these notions of computation some extra oomph, some extra juice that you really don't get at lower levels of computation. And so something really is happening here, something fascinating. And this is kind of a compelling reason to believe we've come up with the right notion of computation. This ability to sort of self-introspect. So what's the idea? So it's kind of what I explained already. You take a Turing machine, and as input, you want to somehow give it another Turing machine. Now, a Turing machine is a set of rules. So, the input to a Turing machine is not a set of rules, it's a set of symbols. But it's not too crazy to imagine coding these rules as symbols, right? The rules are the types of rules are finite, right? It's read this symbol, move to the left, move to the right, replace the symbol with something else. And conditionally on which rule you read. Okay, so all those is just sort of like number of symbols times all these things you can do based on which symbol you read. So it's some finite number. You can code this finite number as a symbol itself, right? Like just zeros and ones. This is much easier to explain to a modern audience that understands computers than to an early audience that kind of imagines symbols as something you scribble with a pen. So okay, you just code this as zeros and ones, and now you give this input to a Turing machine that now needs to interpret these symbols as rules themselves. But, thinking about this a little bit more, it doesn't seem unreasonable, right? You read a symbol, and that symbol itself tells you what the rule should be. And yeah, you can sort of interpret that, right? You can say, hey, the rule is, if I read this symbol that represents this rule, then do that, right? It's sort of a very easy thing to conceptualize, right? You can imagine explaining to someone how to follow rules, right? As a set of rules. That's what you do when you explain a game, right? You explain the rules of the game, but you could also explain to somebody how to understand the rules of a game. Just read it, see what it says to do. So, okay, so what does this buy us? Well, it buys us a lot. It says, hey, you can use Turing machines to observe the behavior of other Turing machines, right? You could take the Turing machine, put it as input to another Turing machine whose execution instructions, run this first Turing machine for a while and see if it outputs 0 or if it outputs 1 or does it run for more than 12 steps or more than 100 steps. So you could really do that. And Turing immediately noticed that this is in his first paper. He very carefully describes what the universal Turing machine is, which is a Turing machine that takes in another Turing machine and some input and runs the input Turing machine on that input, which doesn't necessarily have any additional meaning. And what's kind of exciting, and I'm not sure I want to talk about it in this podcast, but I might just mention it at the end to give a teaser for, maybe the next one, is you can use this phenomenon to mathematically prove that there is no Turing machine that takes as input another Turing machine and says, yes, if that input halts, and says yes, if that input Turing machine halts when it takes in, 0 as its input, and no, if the Turing machine doesn't halt, if it runs forever, right? So the question we want to answer is, does this Turing machine run forever or does it halt? And we want to answer that question by using another Turing machine, right? Because you remember that the idea was Turing machines represent all that is feasible by humans or computers or anything physical. So if we want to determine whether it's feasible to determine whether a machine will eventually halt, then it better be possible using a Turing machine itself. And Turing showed in this kind of very elegant way that you can't actually do that. There is no procedure, no Turing machine which can take in as input another Turing machine and say, yes, this halts if you give it 0 as input. And the reason for that is somewhat simple, but it's not so simple that I can explain it in just a minute. So I'll have to explain that a little bit later. And what's great is that we'll be able to use that result to actually give a very elegant proof of the incompleteness theorem, right? So this inability to computably determine whether a computable process halts or not is going to give us a huge amount of power, at least mathematical power, to prove the limits of certain logical processes. So this is one of the exciting discoveries of science. And Gödel was very excited. He came up with this theorem before this idea. But once this idea came out, he was like, that's the right notion. That's what we should care about. And so this was a very exciting period for all of mathematical logic.